The Long Ships is that other Viking movie, but I like it better than that other Viking movie. Confused? No worries. The Vikings is a 1959 Viking movie starring Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, Ernest Borgnine, and Janet Leigh. The Long Ships is a 1964 Viking movie starring Richard Widmark, Sidney Poitier, Russ Tamblyn, and Rosanna Schiaffino. Not that I'm a particular fan of that particular subgenre, but when in the fjords. So, why do I like The Long Ships better than that other Viking movie? Because The Long Ships is the little engine that could of Viking movies. And that means we have Sidney Poitier doing a weird riff on Othello as he searches for the great golden bell. And that's our MacGuffin. And that's what makes this Viking movie more fun to watch than that Viking movie. Because what we really have here is a quest movie. Not unlike Jason and the Argonauts. Except this time it's not a quest for the Golden Fleece. It's a quest for the great golden bell. And that golden bell is no joke. The great Maurice Binder does the opening montage explaining the history of the bell. From the montage, we cut to Richard Widmark as a shipwrecked Viking, repeating the story of the bell to a crowd of Arabs in a marketplace. He hints that he knows the bell's location, but only for a price. He's immediately branded as a liar and is soon arrested by the Moors and brought to Sydney for interrogation. Widmark escapes by jumping out a window. Apparently, he manages to swim all the way home to Northern Europe. Neither his father nor his younger brother are happy to see him when it turns out he lost the ship he first set out with, but they're even more upset when he tells them he needs a new ship. And then he tells them why. To find the mother of voices, a bell made of solid gold that's as tall as 3 tall men. 3 tall men? Oscar Homolka plays Krok, the Viking shipbuilder who's been cheated out of his fee for building the king's funeral ship. He also plays my favorite Russian spy, Colonel Stock, in Funeral in Berlin and Billion Dollar Brain. He's having a great time in this movie. 3 tall men? So the Vikings kidnap the Viking king's daughter and steal the Viking king's funeral ship. Because, after all, isn't that what Vikings do? So they set sail to find the great golden bell, but a maelstrom washes them ashore, and they are soon captured by Sidney Poitier and the Moors. Sydney's queen is played by the attractive Rosanna Schiaffino. Anyway, in Sydney's very first scene, we see how this marriage is going. She's pining for him, but he won't touch her. Sidney and the movie are using his obsession with the golden bell as an excuse for his reluctance. But we know what's really going on here. This was risky stuff back in 1964, especially in America, where the country was simmering with racial tension. Not only that, but when Sydney has the Viking king's daughter, the Viking king's blonde daughter, groomed to take her place in his harem, everyone sits a little more forward in their seats. Me, I'm 11 years old, and I'm thinking there's more going on in this movie than just a search for a great golden bell. But never fear, Russ Tamblyn breaks in and saves her from a fate worse than death, and white America breathes a big sigh of relief. And not only that, but there's a scene where the Vikings raid Sydney's harem because, after all, isn't that what Vikings do? Now that scene is played for laughs in an adolescent schoolboy sort of way, and that's the way it was taken back then. But it sure plays differently now. In one scene, after they're captured by the Moors, one Viking wonders where they are, and Widmark replies, civilization. And it's true, the Moors are more civilized. They live in cities built of marble while the Vikings live in thatched huts. Civilized though they may be, they still have capital punishment. In this case, it's a ride on the Mare of Steel. Widmark and Sidney's wife join forces to help each side find the bell. But Sidney gets the wrong idea about which forces are being joined, so it looks like Widmark's going to ride that horse. But fortunately, the rest of the Vikings say they won't go without him. So we set off once again to find the Great Golden Bell. There are battles and attempted mutinies and seafaring dangers throughout the film, but the real highlight is when they do finally find the Great Golden Bell. It appears to be part of a chapel mounted high on a cliff, but when Sidney walks out of the chapel housing the bell, he's stunned into silence. Widmark runs into the chapel, only to find a small golden bell hanging from the ceiling. In frustration, he flings it aside and that's when they discover that the entire dome is the bell. It's a clever reveal. But getting the bell down to the ship anchored below is another matter altogether. It's a pretty spectacular sequence. Widmark and Poitier haul the bell back to civilization, but in their absence, the Viking king has taken over the city. Poitier's wife, the beautiful Rosanna Schiaffino, runs forward trying to warn them, but that wanker Edward Judd spears her, and the final battle takes place. But in the end, Sidney is hoisted on his own petard, so to speak, as he's crushed by the bell he's long obsessed over. And even though he's the bad guy, when he dies, Widmark holds his hand. Best of enemies? Or maybe best of friends? Richard Widmark had a long-time friendship with Sidney Poitier, dating back to 1950s No Way Out, and then continuing into the 60s with the Longships and the Bedford Incident. Richard Widmark is not the most athletic of action heroes, but he plays his role as a Viking con man with a sardonic, contemporary edge. Works for me. Now, everyone loves Sidney Poitier. It's hard to underestimate his importance. He was the gateway drug for baby boomer white boys like me to get a peek at another world. And that other world couldn't have asked for a better representative. Russ Tamblyn does what Russ Tamblyn does best, dancing and tumbling all over the place, because after all, isn't that what Russ Tamblyn does? Outside of the leads, the cast is made up of mostly British supporting players, like Edward Judd, Gordon Jackson, and Lionel Jeffries as a eunuch in Sidney's harem. Legendary cinematographer Jack Cardiff takes over the directing helm, and not surprisingly, the film looks great. He makes a little bit go a long way. They don't make these kind of big-budget action-adventure movies anymore. Movies like Lawrence of Arabia, Spartacus, Khartoum, or Zulu. Today's audiences were raised on comic book movies, and the Longships provided my generation with the same kind of escapist entertainment. When this movie was first released on VHS, the last 5 minutes were gone. No end scene, no climax, no end credits. It just stopped. So I went to the store where I bought the tape and we ran it. And they said, "You're right, it just stops." It turns out that the company that was licensed to manufacture these tapes only used tapes that had one speed. As a consequence, the last 5 minutes of the movie were gone. Eventually, they had to recall all those tapes because the boomer was on the job. And after all, isn't that what we boomers do?